To anyone else, it was a monument to failure. A rusted-out radio relay station perched on a windswept bluff in the gray expanse of the Pacific Northwest, its skeletal tower clawing at a perpetually overcast sky. For Elias Thorne, a man hollowed out by a grief so vast it had its own gravity, it was a fitting inheritance, a kingdom of decay. His days bled into one another, a monotonous smear of silence punctuated only by the rhythmic scrape of a bottle against the scarred surface of his kitchen table and the quiet, judging presence of the old German shepherd, Major, who had come with the deed. The dog, a relic as much as the station, would watch him with eyes the color of burnt amber, a low rumble sometimes vibrating in his deep chest, a sound that felt less like a growl and more like a warning. Elias was a ghost haunting the shell of a man, and the dog was his keeper, the one living thing that refused to let him fade completely. But tonight, the dog's strange, obsessive behavior had escalated, a frantic whining and scratching not at the door to be let out, but at a solid steel panel on a defunct transmitter console that hadn't seen a spark of life in 50 years. To Elias, it was worthless junk, but the dog was consumed by it, convinced that behind that rusted metal plate lay a $250 million secret that could either save Elias or get him killed. We are so grateful you're here with us today. If our stories of redemption and loyalty resonate with you, please consider supporting our work by subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to bring these narratives to life. And we'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. The silence that Elias had cultivated for 5 years was a fragile thing. It wasn't peace. It was the absence of sound, a vacuum he pulled around himself like a shroud. In the city, there were too many echoes of Clara, the scent of rain on hot pavement, the particular slant of late afternoon light through a window, the distant chime of a bell that sounded like her laugh. Here, on this forgotten cliffside, there was only the wind, the cry of gulls, and the steady, breathing presence of the dog. The property had come to him through a string of legalities he hadn't bothered to understand, the final asset of a man named Henderson, a former mentor from his early days in the service, a man he hadn't spoken to in 2 decades. The letter from the lawyer was brief. Henderson had passed, he had no family, and his entire estate, this crumbling station and its canine guardian, was now Elias's. He'd come here not to claim an inheritance, but to complete his retreat from the world. The rust was honest. The decay was familiar. It matched the ruin within him. Major had been Henderson's dog, and his loyalty had transferred to Elias with a solemnity that felt like a duty. He was an old dog, his muzzle frosted with gray, his hips a little stiff in the cold mornings, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and deeply perceptive. He seemed to understand the topography of Elias's grief, knowing when to press a cold nose into his hand and when to simply lie across the threshold of the bedroom, a silent, furry sentinel against the nightmares. For months, this was their rhythm. Elias would drink until the memories blurred, and Major would stand watch. But something had shifted. The dog, once a passive companion, had become an agent of purpose. It started subtly, a paw on his knee when he reached for the second bottle of whiskey before noon, a low whine and a nudge of his head toward the dusty workshop filled with dormant tools. Then it became an obsession, focused entirely on the main control room and the largest of the transmitter consoles, a hulking beast of gray steel and darkened vacuum tubes. Tonight, the dog's insistence was a fever pitch. He paced before the console, whining, his claws ticking on the concrete floor. He would stop, press his nose to one specific panel near the floor, and then look back at Elias, his amber eyes burning with an unnerving lucidity. Finally, unable to bear the sound any longer, Elias heaved himself from his chair. All right, what is it, boy?" he slurred, his voice a rusty hinge. He knelt, the cold of the concrete seeping through his jeans. The panel was unremarkable, secured by 4 flathead screws, their slots choked with grime and rust. Major nudged his hand with his wet nose, then scratched at the panel again, a sharp, metallic screech that set Elias's teeth on edge. "There's nothing there, you crazy mutt," but the dog just whined again, a high, pleading sound that cut through the fog of alcohol. It was the first thing that had truly demanded his attention in years. With a sigh that felt like it was dredged from the bottom of his soul, Elias pushed himself up and shuffled to the workshop. He returned with a rusty screwdriver and a can of penetrating oil. He sprayed the screws, the acrid smell filling the air. As he worked the first screw, the corroded metal groaning in protest, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a spark of curiosity, fanned by the unwavering conviction in his dog's eyes. The metal fought him, but his hands, though unsteady, remembered their training. The discipline was buried deep, but it was there. After 10 minutes of straining, the final screw gave way with a sharp crack. The panel came loose. Elias pried it open, a cloud of dust billowing out. Behind it, nestled in a space that shouldn't have existed, was a small, leather-bound journal. Major stopped whining instantly. He sat, his tail giving a single heavy thump against the floor. He looked from the journal to Elias, a clear and unmistakable expression of satisfaction on his face. Elias stared at the book. It was old, the leather cracked but supple. Felt heavy in his hands, weighted with more than just paper. He ran a thumb over the cover. There was no title, no inscription. He opened it. The first page was filled with a neat, precise script, but it was nonsensical, a jumble of letters and symbols. A code. Elias's breath caught in his chest. He was a former communications sergeant, an 18 Echo in the Green Berets. His specialty was not just sending and receiving signals, but breaking them. For the first time in 5 years, a part of his brain that had been dormant, a part he associated with a life before the fall, flickered to life. He looked at the indecipherable text, then at the stoic German shepherd sitting patiently at his side. The dog hadn't just found a book. He had found a key, and he had delivered it to the one man who might know how to turn it. The silence of the station no longer felt empty, felt expectant. The wind rattling the windows sounded less like a lament and more like a whisper, beckoning him toward a past that was far from dead and buried. Elias took the journal and a fresh bottle of coffee back to the kitchen table, the whiskey bottle now forgotten on the floor. He set a lamp beside him, its yellow glow pushing back the oppressive gloom. Major settled at his feet, his chin resting on his paws, watching. The journal was a simple substitution cipher, a type a novice might use, but the key was elusive. There was no repeated phrasing, no common letter patterns that gave it away. Henderson, he recalled, was a man who appreciated elegance in his puzzles. He wouldn't use a key that was arbitrary. It had to be personal. Elias closed his eyes, trying to dredge up a memory of the man, not the legend. He remembered Henderson's office at Fort Bragg, a small, cluttered room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. On the wall, above a map of the world bristling with colored pins, was a framed quote. Elias had read it 100 times while waiting to be briefed. He focused, pushing past the static of his grief, reaching for the shape of the words. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, Thomas Jefferson. It was Henderson's mantra. He grabbed a notepad and a pen, his hand moving with a newfound steadiness. He wrote out the alphabet. Then, beneath it, he wrote out the key phrase, omitting repeated letters, THEPRICOFD He filled in the rest of the alphabet in order. Equals T, B equals H, C equals E, and so on. He turned back to the first page of the journal and began the painstaking work of transcription. The first few words emerged from the jumble. May 10, 1983. They called it obsolete. Elias's heart began to beat a little faster. It was working. He spent the next several hours lost in the task, the world shrinking to the pool of light on the table, the scratch of his pen, and the steady breathing of the dog at his feet. The journal wasn't a personal diary in the traditional sense. It was a log, a philosophical treatise, and a technical manual all in one. Henderson wrote of his disillusionment. He had been a signals intelligence pioneer during the Cold War, a patriot who believed in the clarity of his country's mission. But as the world changed, he saw that clarity muddy into shades of gray. He saw greed and political expediency replace duty and honor. He felt the country he had served was losing its way, compromised from within by men who valued profit over principle. This station, Elias learned, was Henderson's Ark. Decommissioned by the government as a relic of an analog age, Henderson had purchased it for a pittance using his own savings. But he hadn't let it die. Over 2 decades, he had secretly, meticulously, and brilliantly retrofitted it. He described sourcing rare parts from defunct Soviet listening posts, hand-machining components in his workshop, and writing his own software to bridge the gap between analog purity and digital power. He wasn't just maintaining a museum. He was building a fortress, a communications hub completely off the grid, invisible to modern surveillance, capable of broadcasting on frequencies long forgotten, a ghost in the machine of the global network. He called it the Sentinel. He believed a time was coming when the truth would need a secure channel, a place from which a final, incorruptible signal could be sent. As Elias read, the image of the station began to transform in his mind. The rust was no longer decay. It was camouflage. The silence was not emptiness. It was readiness. The junk was a sleeping giant, and he, Elias, was its new keeper. The last entry he translated that night was short, written in a shakier hand. The wolves are circling the flock. They think the shepherd is gone, and the dog is old. They do not understand the nature of loyalty. They do not know about the final broadcast. Below the entry was not text, but a drawing. It was a clean, precise schematic of a unique vacuum tube, unlike any he had ever seen. Beside it was a radio frequency, 28,555 megahertz, a dead spot on the 10-meter band, and a string of numbers. Elias stared at the numbers. They weren't a code. They were too simple. A date? A serial number? He looked up from the journal, his eyes scanning the dark room. His gaze fell on a framed photograph on the wall, one he hadn't paid much attention to before. It was an old black-and-white photo of a younger Henderson standing proudly in front of the station's main transmission tower, the massive steel lattice that dominated the property. The numbers, they weren't a code. They were coordinates. Henderson, the old puzzle-maker, had hidden his next clue not in a book, but in the land itself. A mission began to crystallize in Elias's mind, sharp and clear, cutting through the fog. It wasn't just about fixing a broken-down station anymore. It was about honoring a legacy. It was about understanding the nature of loyalty. It was about preparing for the final broadcast. He stood up, his body aching but his mind alive. He walked over to Major and knelt, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" he whispered. "You knew all along." The dog responded with a low rumble of contentment and a lick on his cheek. The partnership was sealed. The restoration had begun. The next morning, Elias awoke before dawn. The first time in years he had greeted the day without the dull throb of a hangover. The air was cold and clean, and as he stepped outside with Major, the rising sun painted the underside of the clouds in hues of rose and violet. He looked at the main transmission tower, a 300-foot spire of steel, its base anchored in a massive concrete footing. Armed with the journal, a compass, and a tape measure, he began to work. The coordinates from the journal were a simple offset, a distance and a bearing from the tower's northwestern leg. He measured it out precisely, his movements economical, the muscle memory of land navigation exercises returning with surprising ease. The spot was unremarkable, just a patch of hard, gravelly soil. He returned to the workshop and found a shovel and a pickaxe. The work was brutal. The ground was rocky and unforgiving. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His back screamed in protest. His hands, softened by years of inactivity, blistered and bled. But he didn't stop. With every swing of the pickaxe, with every shovelful of dirt he tossed aside, he felt like he was chipping away not just at the earth, but at the calcified shell of his own grief. The physical pain was a welcome distraction, a clean, sharp sensation that crowded out the dull ache in his soul. Major sat nearby, watching him, a silent overseer. Every hour he would bring Elias a mouthful of cold water from his bowl, a gesture so tender and deliberate it almost broke him. After 4 feet, the shovel struck something hard with a metallic thud, not the dull clank of rock. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his raw hands, scraping away the dirt. He uncovered the top of a military-grade Pelican case, its olive-drab surface caked in mud. It was heavy. He heaved it out of the hole and onto the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He wiped the latches clean and popped them open. The seal broke with a hiss of preserved air. Inside, nestled in perfect custom-cut foam, were 2 items. The first was a set of 5 vacuum tubes, their glass gleaming. They were the exact tubes from the schematic in Henderson's journal, beautiful, handcrafted artifacts of a bygone era. The second item was a single reel-to-reel audio tape. Elias carried the case back to the control room as if it were a holy relic. The station had a reel-to-reel player, another piece of obsolete equipment he had ignored. He spent an hour carefully cleaning the machine's heads and guides, his hands surprisingly gentle. He threaded the tape, his fingers deft and sure. He powered on the machine, and after a moment of warm-up hum, the speakers crackled to life. Henderson's voice filled the room. It was older than Elias remembered, gravelly and tired, but still possessed of its old authority. "If you're listening to this, son," the voice began, and Elias felt a jolt. "It means the old dog still has a good nose. And it means I've put my trust in the right man." Henderson went on to explain everything. He was part of a small, secret group of Cold War patriots from various intelligence and financial sectors. They called themselves the Janus Group. They had watched as Black Ops funding was slashed, leaving vital off-the-books networks and assets to wither on the vine. They believed that foreign and domestic threats were being ignored for political and financial gain. So they created their own solution. Over decades, they had built a private, untraceable financial network, siphoning off fractions of cents from trillions of dollars in global transactions. A digital ghost in the world's economic machine. The money, now totaling $250 million, was held in a decentralized, cryptographically sealed trust. It wasn't for personal enrichment. It was an emergency fund, a war chest to be used only to finance operations deemed critical to national security when the official channels failed. Henderson was the network's gatekeeper, and this station, the Sentinel, was the only key. The unique vacuum tubes, when installed in the main transmitter, would allow it to send a one-time digital handshake on that obscure frequency, the final broadcast which would unlock the trust and transfer control. "The wolves I mentioned," Henderson's voice grew grim, "they aren't foreign agents. They're vultures from our own side. Men who found out about Janus, but see it only as a prize to be plundered. They've been trying to find me, trying to find the key. I've held them off, but my time is running out. The responsibility, Elias, now falls to you. Protect the Sentinel. Protect the legacy. Use the fund as it was intended for the good of the country to protect the unprotected. The access protocols are woven into the very fabric of this station. You have the skills to find them. Restore the station. Restore the purpose." The tape ended. The room was silent again, but the silence was now thrumming with the weight of Henderson's last will and testament. Elias looked at the dormant console, at the gleaming tubes in the case, at the loyal dog by his side. His mission, once a vague notion of honoring a mentor, was now terrifyingly concrete. He was the guardian of a $250 million secret, the shepherd of a flock he didn't know, and the target of wolves he couldn't see. The revelation settled into Elias not as a burden, but as a framework. For the first time since Clara's death, he had a mission with stakes higher than his own survival. The restoration of the Sentinel became his singular focus, a form of active therapy more potent than any pill or bottle. He worked from sunup to sundown, his days governed by the logic of repair. The grief was still there, a constant low hum beneath the surface, but now it had a counterfrequency. Purpose. He started with the infrastructure. He climbed the 300-foot tower, his old special forces training kicking in, moving with a vertiginous confidence he thought he'd lost forever. He replaced corroded bolts, tightened guy wires, and cleaned the insulators, his hands growing calloused and strong. From that height, the world spread out below him, a panorama of green forest and gray sea. It was the first time he had felt anything close to perspective in years. He wasn't just a broken man on a lonely cliff. He was a watchman on a tower. Down in the station, he tackled the electronics. He spent weeks hunched over schematics, tracing circuits, replacing brittle wiring, and soldering new capacitors into place. The work was intricate, demanding a level of focus that left no room for haunting memories. The smell of solder and ozone replaced the stale scent of whiskey. He cleaned every switch, polished every dial, and tested every connection. He scavenged parts from the less critical equipment, cannibalizing the old to give life to the new, just as Henderson had. Slowly, painstakingly, the control room began to transform. The grime-covered consoles gleamed under new fluorescent lights he'd installed. Dead indicator lights flickered back to life, first one, then a dozen, their soft glows of red and green like nascent stars in the dark. He brought the primary power generator back online, its deep, rumbling heartbeat filling the station with a sense of vitality. Major was his constant shadow, a silent partner in the restoration. The dog would lie for hours on a worn rug in the corner of the control room, a comforting, solid presence. Sometimes Elias would talk to him, explaining the function of a particular circuit or the challenge of a repair, his voice losing its rust. He wasn't just talking to a dog. He was thinking aloud, externalizing the problems, and in doing so, finding solutions. His forced isolation was broken by necessity. He needed supplies, wire, fuel, specialized components he couldn't salvage. This meant trips to the nearest town, a small, sleepy place nestled in a harbor 20 miles down the winding coastal highway. The first trip was an ordeal. The chatter in the hardware store, the casual friendliness of the checkout girl, the simple act of standing in a line, it all felt alien and overwhelming. He kept his answers short, his gaze fixed on the floor, his purchases made with a grim efficiency. He was a ghost, slipping in and out, leaving no impression. But the town had a rhythm of its own, and it slowly began to notice him. The owner of the hardware store, a kindly older woman named Martha with flour-dusted hands from her side-baking business, started setting aside items she thought he might need. "Saw these mil-spec connectors in a catalog," she'd say, her voice gentle. "Reminded me of the stuff my husband used to work on. You restoring that old place up on the point." Elias would just nod, pay, and leave, but her quiet persistence was a small, steady pressure against the walls he had built. He started buying her fresh-baked bread, the simple transaction a step toward re-engaging with the world. He was still isolated, but he was no longer entirely alone. This new connection, however tenuous, was a vulnerability. It was a wire leading from his fortress back to the world, a wire that could carry more than just goodwill. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Elias was calibrating the main antenna array, a sleek, black SUV, its tinted windows gleaming, crunched up the gravel driveway. It was the first visitor the station had seen since he'd arrived. Major, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, rose to his feet, a low growl vibrating in his chest. A man in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, stepped out of the vehicle. He had a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Elias felt an immediate, instinctive dislike for him. "Elias Thorne?" the man called out, his voice smooth as polished stone. Elias didn't answer, just watched him from the base of the tower, his hand resting on a heavy wrench. The man walked closer, his expensive shoes ill-suited for the rough terrain. "My name is Marcus Vance. I'm a senior partner with Apex Development." The name was a lie, a thin veil for his true identity. It was his brother, Marcus Thorne, a man Elias hadn't seen since Clara's funeral, where Marcus had offered condolences that felt more like a business transaction. He had changed his appearance, a subtle shift in hair, a clean-shaven face where a beard used to be, but the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and devoid of any familial warmth. Elias's heart turned to a block of ice. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that this was not a coincidence. The wolves Henderson had written about had arrived. "I'm here to make you an offer," Marcus continued, gesturing vaguely at the station. "Apex is consolidating land along this coast for a new luxury resort project. This property is the last piece of the puzzle. We're prepared to offer you a very generous sum for it. $5 million. Cash. You can be off this rock and on a beach in Tahiti by next week. Elias remained silent, his mind racing. His brother. Here. Why? The name changed, the developer facade, it was all a cover. He was hunting for the Janus fortune. He must have somehow tracked Henderson here and was now circling the inheritance. The offer was a test, a way to gauge if Elias knew what he was sitting on. If he took the money, it meant he was ignorant and Marcus could take the station apart at his leisure. If he refused, it meant he knew. Elias's gaze flickered to Major, who was now standing rigidly beside him, the growl a constant, low threat. The dog knew, too. The animal's intuition was an unerring compass for deceit. Elias tightened his grip on the wrench. His world, which had just begun to find a new, fragile order, was tilting violently off its axis. He thought of Henderson's warning, of the legacy he was sworn to protect. He looked at his brother's predatory smile and saw the vulture Henderson had described. The time for hiding was over. The property is not for sale, Elias said, his voice flat and hard, each word a stone laid in a wall. Marcus's smile tightened, the warmth vanishing completely. I think you should reconsider, he said, his tone dropping the pretense of friendliness. Everything has a price. It would be a shame if you were to find yourself in a position where you had no choice but to sell. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat. The first move in a game Elias now had to play, a game where the board was his sanctuary and the prize was a $250 million secret. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that his brother did not play to lose. The black SUV departed, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in its wake. The encounter had shattered the therapeutic peace of Elias's work, replacing it with the cold, familiar hum of imminent conflict. The wolf had shown its face. The threat was no longer an abstract concept from a dead man's journal. It was real, and it had a name he knew all too well. Elias spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened alert, his senses sharpened by years of training. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching vehicle. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. He wasn't just a restorer anymore. He was a soldier defending a position. He checked the perimeter, noting sight lines, avenues of approach, and potential kill zones. He inventoried the tools in his workshop, seeing them not as implements of repair but as potential weapons. The transformation was seamless. A switch flipped in the core of his being. The skills he had tried to bury, the ones that reminded him of a world of violence and loss, were now his most vital assets. A week passed. The silence from his brother was more unnerving than an open attack. Elias knew Marcus's methods. He preferred to apply pressure indirectly, to create an environment of instability and fear until his target broke. The attack came not against Elias, but against his fragile link to the outside world. He drove into town for fuel and supplies, and the atmosphere was different. The usual quiet friendliness was gone, replaced by averted eyes and strained silence. When he walked into the hardware store, Martha looked pale and distressed. "Elias," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe you should just sell that land." He saw a fresh bruise, poorly concealed with makeup, high on her cheekbone. "What happened, Martha?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. She flinched. "Two men came by yesterday," she stammered, refusing to meet his eyes. "They said I was overcharging for certain supplies. Said it was bad for business. They said it would be a shame if my little bakery had a fire inspection that went poorly. They hadn't touched her store. They had touched her." It was a message, delivered with brutal efficiency. The message was clear. Anyone who helps you will suffer. Your sanctuary is an island, and we control the sea around it. Rage, cold and pure, washed through Elias. This was no longer about a secret fortune or a dead man's legacy. It was personal. Marcus had crossed a line, drawing an innocent person into his predatory game. Elias drove back to the station, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. That night, as a storm rolled in from the ocean, lashing the station with wind and rain, the second part of the attack came. The power from the town grid flickered and died. The station was plunged into darkness and silence, save for the howling wind. Elias wasn't worried. His first major project had been to get Henderson's diesel generator fully operational. He went to the generator shed, and his blood ran cold. The fuel line had been expertly cut, and the starter motor had been smashed with a hammer. It was professional sabotage. He was cut off, isolated, without power for his tools or his nascent security systems. They were tightening the noose, trying to break him down piece by piece, psychologically and logistically. He stood in the rain-swept darkness, the wind tearing at him, and felt a profound sense of being hunted. He returned to the main control room, lighting a few kerosene lamps. The shadows danced on the walls, making the silent consoles look like sleeping beasts. Major pressed against his leg, a warm, solid presence in the encroaching darkness. He had to get the station fully operational. He had to install Henderson's final components. The final broadcast was no longer a theoretical endgame. It was his only path to survival, his only way to fight back. He had to become the ghost Henderson had written about, using the station not just as a shield, but as a sword. The next day, Elias worked with a frantic, desperate energy. He repaired the generator using spare parts and sheer ingenuity, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. As the generator roared back to life and the lights flooded the station, it felt like a major victory, a defiant roar against the darkness his brother was trying to impose. With power restored, he turned his attention to the core of the Sentinel. He had one last puzzle to solve. Henderson's audio log had mentioned that the final access protocols were woven into the very fabric of the station. It wasn't just about installing the tubes. There was another layer of security. He spent 2 days poring over the station's original blueprints and Henderson's modifications, cross-referencing them with notes from the journal. He found it in a detail he had previously overlooked. A custom-built signal routing board Henderson had labeled simply as the harmonizer according to the notes. It was designed to filter and condition the outgoing signal for the final broadcast, but it required a specific, complex sequence of patch cables to be configured correctly. The sequence wasn't written down anywhere. He stared at the harmonizer, a daunting panel of hundreds of identical input and output jacks. The solution, he realized, had to be personal, another of Henderson's elegant puzzles. What was the most personal thing to Henderson? His disillusionment, his service, his lost faith. Elias's mind went back to the old office, to the map on the wall bristling with pins. Henderson had once told him about his most difficult operation, a failed mission in East Germany in 1961, the year the wall went up. It had haunted him his entire life. The mission was codenamed Operation Chimera. Elias searched the station's logbooks and found the original military archives Henderson had kept. He found the after-action report for Chimera. It contained call signs, frequencies, and casualty lists. It was a litany of failure. But buried in the report was a sequence of numbers. The authentication code for the mission, a code that was never used because the mission was compromised before it began. It was a number representing the ultimate failure of the system Henderson had once believed in. With trembling hands, Elias began translating the code into a patching sequence, using the numbers to dictate the connections on the harmonizer board. As he plugged in the final cable, a single green light, labeled synchronized, lit up on the panel. It was done. The system was ready. All it needed were the tubes. And then, as he was about to retrieve them, he found one last thing tucked into the back of the Chimera mission folder. It was a slim file, one that didn't belong. It wasn't military. It contained copies of financial records, encrypted emails, and a single grainy photograph of a blue sedan with a distinct dent in the rear bumper. Elias's world stopped. It was Clara's car. The file was a ghost. A whisper from a past Elias thought was sealed. It contained Henderson's last, most terrible discovery. He had been using the Sentinel's latent surveillance capabilities, its ability to discreetly intercept and analyze digital traffic, to monitor the men he suspected were hunting him. He had been watching Marcus Thorne. And in doing so, he had stumbled upon something else entirely. The encrypted emails, which Henderson had managed to break, were between Marcus and a man listed only as the mechanic, They were dated the week before Clara's death. They were a contract. Marcus had discovered that Clara, who worked as a paralegal, had accidentally uncovered proof of his vast money laundering operation while organizing files for a corporate merger case her firm was handling. She didn't know the full extent of what she had, but she knew it was deeply illegal. She had copied the files, planning to speak to a senior partner, and then to the authorities. The emails were Marcus's response. He hired the mechanic to stage an accident. A cut brake line. A forced spin-out on a rain-slicked highway off-ramp. The grainy photo was from a traffic camera near the crash site. Taken moments before the accident, it showed Clara's blue sedan, and trailing it, a black tow truck that had no business being there. It wasn't a random tragedy. It was an execution. The air left Elias's lungs. The control room, his sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. The grief he had been managing, channeling into work and purpose, erupted. It was no longer a dull ache. It was a white-hot, eviscerating fire. The face of his brother, Marcus, swam in his vision, his slick smile, his cold eyes. The man who had offered him empty condolences at his wife's funeral was the man who had ordered her death. The wound that had defined Elias's last 5 years, the source of his brokenness, was not a cruel twist of fate. It was a calculated act of violence perpetrated by his own blood. The stakes of his mission fused instantly and irrevocably with the core of his trauma. This was no longer about protecting a legacy or a secret fund. It was about justice for Clara. The Sentinel was no longer just a communications station. It was a weapon of vengeance. The $250 million was no longer a patriotic war chest. It was the motive for his wife's murder. Marcus didn't just want the money. He needed it to cover the tracks of the very crimes Clara had discovered. Elias sank to his knees, the file clutched in his hand, and a single ragged sob tore from his throat. Major, sensing the shift, came to him, pushing his great head under Elias's hand, whining softly. The dog grounded him, pulling him back from the abyss. Elias looked up, his eyes burning with a new, terrible fire. He would not break. He would not run. He would finish the restoration. He would bring the Sentinel fully to life, and he would use it to burn his brother's world to the ground. The watchman on the tower had found his true north. It was vengeance. The discovery galvanized Elias, transforming his grief into a diamond-hard resolve. He was no longer just a defender, he was a hunter. But he knew a direct confrontation with Marcus would be foolish. His brother had resources, manpower, and a complete lack of morality. Elias had a fortified position, a unique set of skills, and a very loyal dog. He had to make Marcus come to him on his terms into a kill box of his own design. He had to make a costly choice. To bait the trap, he had to reveal that he knew something. He had to dangle the key in front of the wolf. Using a secure, anonymized email service Henderson had detailed in the journal, Elias sent a single, untraceable message to the corporate email address of Marcus Vance at Apex Development. The message contained only a string of numbers, the authentication code for Operation Chimera. It was a message with a double meaning. To Marcus, it would be meaningless, a piece of random data. But Elias knew his brother would pass it on to his technical experts, the people who were actually hunting for the Janus key. To them, the code would be an electrifying revelation, proof that the inheritor of the station knew about the deep-level security protocols. It was a declaration. I have the key. Come and get it. He was inviting the fight, pulling the pin on the grenade. Now he prepared for war. The restoration work took on a new, tactical dimension. Every repair, every calibration was now part of a larger defense plan. His special forces training, long dormant, came roaring to the forefront of his mind. He wasn't just fixing a radio station. He was fortifying a castle. He repurposed the station's powerful directional antennas. They were designed to broadcast signals, but with a few modifications to the preamplifiers, they could also be used as highly sensitive passive listening devices, turning the entire coastline into his personal surveillance grid. He could track vehicle movements, listen to radio chatter, and detect electronic signals. The tower was no longer just a mast. It was his eye in the sky. Next, he turned to the station's power systems. He created a series of electronic tripwires. If any of the exterior security cameras he'd repaired were disabled, or if certain doors were forced, the station's main power grid would automatically switch to a new configuration. It would look like a power failure, plunging the station into darkness. But in reality, it would divert all available energy to a single, terrifying weapon he had jury-rigged. The station's old degaussing coil, a massive electromagnet designed to wipe magnetic tapes. He'd amplified its power and focused its field. When triggered, it would emit a localized, high-intensity electromagnetic pulse, an EMP. It wouldn't be large enough to affect the town, but it would be more than enough to instantly disable every modern electronic device within the station's perimeter. Cell phones, digital radios, night vision goggles, the electronic ignition on Marcus's SUV. He would blind them and deafen them, forcing them to fight on his terms, in the analog darkness he now commanded. His final preparation was personal. He retrieved the 5 custom vacuum tubes from their case. He handled them with the reverence of a bomb disposal technician. They were the heart of the Sentinel, the key to the final broadcast. He carefully installed 4 of them into the main transmitter, leaving the final, critical tube, the master oscillator, on his workbench. The system was 99% complete, armed and ready, but not yet active. The final tube was his dead man's switch. He then went into the workshop and fabricated a simple harness for Major, fitting it snugly around the dog's powerful chest and shoulders. To the harness, he attached a small, powerful LED strobe light, the kind used for emergency beacons. It was controlled by a simple pressure switch he held in his pocket. In total darkness, a disorienting, flashing strobe moving at the speed of a German shepherd would be a terrifying and confusing weapon. He was turning his loyal companion into a phantom, a ghost in the machine. As he cinched the final strap, he looked into the dog's intelligent eyes. "It's almost time, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For Clara, Major seemed to understand. He licked Elias's hand and stood with a quiet, powerful stillness, ready for the coming storm. Elias Thorne, the broken veteran, was gone. In his place stood Sergeant Thorne, 18 Echo, and he had prepared his battlefield. The response came 2 nights later. A storm was brewing, the same kind of angry, rain-lashed tempest that had raged the night Clara died. Elias saw them first on his modified antenna array, 3 vehicles moving fast, their radio chatter encrypted but their purpose clear. They cut off the main coastal highway a mile in each direction, ensuring no one could get in or out. Then, a single vehicle, the black SUV, broke from the group and began the winding ascent to the station. Elias sat in the darkened control room, the glow of the monitors painting his face in shades of green and blue. Major lay at his feet, preternaturally calm. The SUV came to a stop just outside the perimeter fence. The engine cut out. 4 figures emerged, clad in black tactical gear, their movements professional and precise. One of them was Marcus. Elias watched them cut through the chain-link fence with bolt cutters. They triggered the first silent alarm. Elias's thumb hovered over the EMP trigger. He waited. He needed them all inside the main building, inside the trap. The team moved with practiced ease, sweeping through the outer sheds before converging on the main station door. They used a crowbar to force it open. The moment the door broke from its frame, the second tripwire was triggered. Elias pressed the button. The station's lights, the monitors, everything went black. A deep, resonant thrum vibrated through the concrete floor for a single silent second, the sound of the EMP discharging. Through his night vision scope, which he'd kept shielded in a Faraday cage, Elias saw the invaders' head-mounted lights flicker and die. A chorus of curses echoed in the hall. They were blind. "Fan out. Find the generator," Marcus commanded, his voice tight with frustration. Elias smiled grimly in the darkness. They were looking for a generator he had already booby-trapped. The heavy steel door to the generator room would now be electrified with a non-lethal but brutally effective charge. One of the men touched the handle. A sharp crackle, a scream, and the thud of a body hitting the floor told Elias his trap had worked. 3 to go. Now Elias began to hunt. He moved through the darkened hallways of his station like a wraith, his soft-soled boots making no sound. He was the ghost. He used the station's layout, the labyrinth of corridors and equipment racks. He now knew better than his own reflection, to his advantage. He stalked one of the men, who was fumbling with a useless radio. Elias came up behind him, a shadow in the dark, and neutralized him quickly and silently with a chokehold, the way he'd been trained. Two left. Marcus and his last man were now moving together back to back, creeping toward the control room. They knew their objective was here. Elias retreated into the control room and sealed the heavy door. He had one last trap to spring. He sat in his command chair, the final vacuum tube on the console in front of him, and waited. The handle on the steel door began to turn. Then, a heavy thud as they tried to shoulder it. Another. They were strong, but the door was stronger. A moment of silence. Then the high-pitched whine of a portable power saw cutting into the metal around the lock. They were coming through. The saw cut a ragged hole. A hand reached through to fumble with the interior handle. And then they were in, spilling into the room, weapons raised. Marcus stood there, his face contorted in a mask of fury, a powerful handgun in his hand. His last remaining goon stood beside him. "It's over, Elias," Marcus spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Give me the key. Give me what's mine." Elias didn't move. He just looked at his brother. "It was never yours, Marcus. And you're not here for the money. Not really. You're here to bury what you did to Clara." The color drained from Marcus's face. The mention of her name was a physical blow. "You don't know anything," he snarled. "I know everything," Elias replied, his voice deadly calm. "I know about the mechanic. I know about the brake line. I know you murdered your brother's wife for money." In that moment of shocked silence, Elias hit the switch in his pocket. From the darkest corner of the room, the strobe light on Major's harness erupted, flooding the space with a blinding, disorienting strobing flash. Marcus and his man cried out, shielding their eyes. And out of that flashing darkness, a 90-pound missile of fur and fury launched itself across the room. Major, utterly silent, slammed into the goon, his jaws closing on the man's weapon arm. The man screamed as the gun clattered to the floor. Marcus, momentarily blinded, fired wildly. The shot went wide, shattering a bank of old monitors. Elias seized the opening, lunging not at his brother, but at the transmitter console. He slammed the final vacuum tube into its socket. The Sentinel roared to life. A wave of powerful, disorienting white noise erupted from the speakers he'd wired throughout the room. An acoustic assault that hammered at the senses. Marcus staggered back, disoriented by the strobe and the sound. Elias tackled him, driving him hard against a steel equipment rack. The gun flew from Marcus's hand. The two brothers, locked in a primal struggle, crashed to the floor. Marcus was bigger, stronger, fueled by rage and greed. He got the upper hand, his fingers closing around Elias's throat, squeezing the life from him. Elias's vision began to tunnel. Just as his consciousness started to fade, a black shape blurred past him. Major, having neutralized the first man, leaped over Elias's prone body. He hit Marcus square in the chest, his momentum carrying both of them away from Elias. The dog didn't bite. He didn't need to. He was a battering ram of pure loyalty. Marcus cried out as he was slammed against the console, his head striking the solid steel edge with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The fight was over. Elias lay on the floor, gasping for air, the disorienting strobe flashing, the white noise blaring. He pushed himself up, his body bruised but his spirit unbroken. He looked at the unconscious form of his brother, and then at the magnificent animal standing guard over him, panting softly, his amber eyes glowing in the strobing light. The Sentinel was secure. Justice for Clara had been served. The aftermath was quiet. Elias used an old landline, one he had repaired weeks ago, to make a single, anonymous call to the state police, reporting a violent home invasion and giving them the location. He told them to come prepared for multiple armed hostiles. Before they arrived, He gathered the evidence: Henderson's file on Clara, the Chimera report, and a new audio log he had recorded of Marcus's confession in the control room. He placed it all in a waterproof container and hid it where he knew it would be found. He then wiped the station's short-term logs, erased his brother's fabricated name, and melted back into the shadows of his own home. When the police arrived, they found a scene of chaos. 3 unconscious and injured men, all with extensive criminal records, and a trove of illegal firearms and break-in tools. Marcus Thorne, the prominent developer, was found with a serious concussion and a story that made no sense. A story of a ghost, a blinding light, and a phantom attacker. Faced with the evidence of his own crimes and the testimony of his hired thugs trying to save themselves, his empire crumbled. The files Clara had died to protect were the final nails in his coffin. He was implicated not just in the attack on the station, but in a vast criminal conspiracy, and most importantly, in the cold-blooded murder of Clara Thorne. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. Elias watched it all unfold from a distance, a silent observer to the justice he had set in motion. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, a sad, empty space where his rage had been. The mission was over. He now sat in the fully restored control room of the Sentinel, the consoles humming with quiet power, the indicator lights glowing like a peaceful constellation. In front of him was the transmitter, the final broadcast protocol armed and ready. He had the key to a $250 million fortune. He could vanish, live a life of unimaginable luxury, and leave the world behind for good. He thought of Henderson's words, of his mentor's fervent belief in protecting the unprotected. He thought of Clara's integrity, her quiet courage in the face of a darkness she couldn't have understood. And he knew he couldn't walk away. He spent a week using the Sentinel's formidable power to carefully anonymize and partition the Janus Fund. He took a small, untraceable fraction, enough to live simply and maintain the station for the rest of his days. The vast remainder, over $200 million, he funneled through a labyrinth of shell corporations and charities until it emerged, clean and legitimate, as the endowment for a new foundation. He called it the Clara Thorne Foundation for Whistleblower and Family Support. Its mission was simple: to provide legal protection, financial support, and safe harbor for people like Clara, people who spoke truth to power, and to support the families of fallen soldiers left behind by a system that too often forgot them. His work was done. The station, his inheritance of rust and ruin, was now a beacon of hope, its powerful antennas no longer aimed at enemies, but at listening for those in need. It was a private memorial to the woman he loved and the mentor he respected. His life found a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. He spent his days maintaining the station, managing the Foundation's anonymous board, and walking the cliffs with Major. The old dog's hips were stiffer now, his muzzle almost completely white, but his eyes were still bright, his loyalty an unwavering anchor in Elias's world. One evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the control room, Elias sat in his chair, watching the light fade. Major came and rested his heavy head on Elias's knee. Elias stroked the dog's soft ears, a deep, profound gratitude welling in his chest. The station hadn't been his inheritance. The money hadn't been the secret. The true inheritance was this dog. The secret was that a broken heart could be healed, not by forgetting the past, but by honoring it. Through loyalty, through purpose, and through the quiet, steadfast love of a good dog, the ghost of Elias Thorne had finally found his way home. The deepest wounds are often the ones we believe we have to carry alone, but true loyalty, like a light in the darkest room, shows us a path forward. Elias's story is a testament to the fact that healing isn't about erasing the scars. It's about finding a new purpose for the strength they gave you. His journey from a desolate ruin to a beacon of hope reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are not fortunes to be found, but legacies to be built, and that the most profound guidance can come from the quiet, unwavering presence of a faithful friend. Thank you for joining us for this story. We pour our hearts into creating these narratives, and your support means the world to us. If this story touched you, please consider hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Every interaction helps us to continue this mission. We would be honored to read your own stories of loyalty and redemption in the comments below. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.